Around the year 1900, the president of Mexico was a man named Porfirio Diaz. He had been president for over 30 years. That was odd, because Mexico's constitution said that no one could be president for more than 4 years. Look, between the North and South America, and you'll see a bridge of land that connects them. On this land, which we call Central America, lies the country of Mexico. Like South America, this land was home to Native American tribes before Spanish conquistadors arrived and settled down. Spain claimed Central America for its own and gave it the name New Spain. In 1821, New Spain declared its independence from Spain and became the country of Mexico, which, with its own constitution and its own elected president. President Diaz had been elected again and again and again. He had been president for so long that his presidency had earned itself a name, the Porfiriato. Porfirio Diaz claimed that no one in Mexico wanted to end his presidency by running against him. The truth was that his supporters paid visits to anyone who might be thinking about running for president against Diaz and scared them out of the idea. This had worked for 30 years, but now many Mexicans were growing discontented with Porfirio Diaz's government. Most of the decisions about how Mexico should be run were made by a small and powerful group of very rich men. Diaz had treated the native Central American tribes cruelly. He had ordered them rounded up and sent off to work as slaves on tobacco plantations. Then he took their land away and sold it to his friends and to foreign businessmen. The poor Mexicans, who weren't native Indians, were just as bad off. Even though they worked hard to farm their land, they couldn't sell the food they raised for enough money to feed themselves. And when a dreadful famine swept across Mexico, thousands began to die of starvation. Meanwhile, the powerful, wealthy men who owned large modern farms were still watering their crops with artificial irrigation, raising healthy harvests, and then shipping the food out of the country for sale. People in other countries were ready to pay good money for their produce. Why should they waste it on starving peasants? The rich Mexicans didn't seem to care if the poor people of their own country died. In fact, to the common people of Mexico, they seemed less and less like Mexicans and more like Europeans. Many of them had gone to school in Europe. They dressed like Europeans and talked like Europeans. Some had even begun to speak French instead of Spanish, the language of Mexico. Groups of rebels, like the Young Turks, the Young Italians, and the group that had formed all over Europe a few years earlier, started to band together and protest. They pointed out that for years and years no one had dared to run against Porfirio Diaz. He had only been re-elected again and again because he had no opponent. Mexico needed presidents who would only serve for one term. Mexico needed presidents who would see that all Mexicans got a decent education. In 1910, President Diaz allowed another president candidate to run against him. Francisco Madero was from a rich family and he had a huge fortune of his own. But even though he was a wealthy man who owned large farms, he treated his workers well. He made sure that they had decent houses, good food, and clean water. He sent his own doctors to take care of sick laborers. He even used his own money to build schools for the children of the men and women who worked for him. Madero wanted Mexico to become a true democracy, not a dictatorship, run by a president who never left office. Madero's kindness made him popular and well loved. When Diaz saw that Madero might well beat him In election, he had Francisco Madero arrested and thrown into jail. On the day of the election, Porfirio Diaz officials announced that the Mexicans had once again elected Diaz as president. The day after his fake election, Madero escaped from jail. He left Mexico by dressing himself as a railroad worker and catching a train that took him across the Mexican border into the United States. In San Antonio, Texas, he set up headquarters for a revolutionary group that would fight against President Diaz's government. He used his huge fortune to buy guns and sent them into Mexico for the use of the rebel soldiers who banded together to fight against the Mexican army. One of the most famous of these rebel soldiers was a man named Dorito Arango. Arango was a cattle thief from the north of Mexico, a bandit who had survived through stealing and hiding. But now he became a guerrilla warrior and earned the nickname Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa raised an army of about 300 men, stole enough food and supplies to keep them alive, and began to mount raids and attacks on the government forces. Other revolutionary leaders joined him. All over Mexico, rebels were fighting against the government forces, taking over villages, driving away government officials. The Mexican Revolution was in full swing. Soon, Diaz realized he would not be able to hold on to his power very much longer. He was 80 years old and suffering horribly from an abscessed tooth and other illnesses. He could barely get out of bed. Late one May night, less than a year after the Mexican Revolution began, Diaz hobbled slowly through the dark, surrounded by his advisors. He had agreed to meet a group of rebels outside of the city. Automobiles had been pulled into a circle, their headlights shining on a table where a treaty sat. By signing the treaty, Diaz would promise to give up his power. He bent over the paper and signed it slowly. With a shaking hand, his helper supported him as he walked away. The next day, Diaz left his country and went to France. He died in Paris 4 years later. Madero marched into Mexican City to the cheers of people. The wife of an American diplomat who watched the victory parade wrote, "People came from far and near, in all sorts of conveyances or on foot, just to see him, to hear his voice, even to touch his garments for help and healing." It is a curious experience to see a people at the moment of what they are convinced is their salvation, to see the man they hail as the Messiah. The only thing they didn't shout was Hosanna. The people of Mexico hoped that Madero would bring a true democracy with peace and prosperity to Mexico. Unfortunately, Madero found himself with a big problem. All of the rebel leaders who had helped him fight for Diaz's removal had different ideas about how Mexico should be reformed. Some of them just wanted free elections. Others wanted the government to take the land owned by foreign businessmen away from them and give it back to the people. And the rich men of Mexico, even those who had supported Madero's presidency, wanted as little change as possible. For 2 years, Madero struggled to make all of these different powers work together and failed. Once again, rebellion broke out. This time, it was against the very man the rebels had hoped to put into power. Madero found himself sending out the Mexican army to fight against the revolutionaries who had been once his allies. By February 1913, the rebels had invaded Mexico City itself and had set up their headquarters in the government armory, the place where weapons are stored. Madero's troops besieged them. For 10 days, the two sides shot at each other. The shells set off fires all over the city, burning homes and stores. people who left their homes were likely to get caught in the crossfire. The people of Mexico City were too frightened to leave their homes. Some of them ended up cooking and eating their pet cats in order to not starve of hunger. These days became known as the 10 Tragic Days. Finally, rebel forces charged into President Madero's office and dragged him out. They put him under guard and took control of the city. The leaders of the rebels and a general named Victoriano Huerta was now in charge of Mexico City. Huerta and the other rebels promised that they would keep Madero safe, but late one night, Madero was murdered by Huerta's officers. Huerta told the people of Mexico that the ex-president had been accidentally killed while trying to escape. Now Mexico was under the rule of Huerta, who was as much of a dictator as Diaz had been. But Huerta didn't keep power for long. The rebel leader Pancho Villa, who had fought against Diaz, continued to fight against Huerta. Less than a year later, Huerta himself fled. For the next 30 years, civil war, assassinations, struggle and rebellion continued in Mexico. The Mexican Revolution had gotten rid of a tyrannical president, but it had not brought peace to Mexico. Let's review. The injustices under President Diaz was decisions were made by a small group of rich men. Central American tribes were sent off to work as slaves. Poor Mexicans starving while rich farmers were sent their crops out of the country. And then Diaz's men kept other candidates from running for president. And then the Mexican Revolution was began by Francisco Madero in San Antonio, Texas. He was joined by Pancho Villa and other rebels. Diaz was driven out of the country, and after 2 years, Madero was arrested and murdered. Victoria Huerta ruled for less than a year, and 30 years of civil war, assassination, and struggle began.
That's off! I shouldn't have had those artichoke poppers.